Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 18 January 2025. 247 years ago today, on 18 January 1778, which was a Sunday, Captain James Cook discovered the Hawaiian Islands. Here's Cook's own record of the discovery from his journals. Quote, Friday, 2nd January. We continued to see birds every day of the sorts last mentioned, sometimes in greater numbers than at others. And between the latitude of 10 and 11, we saw several turtle. All of these looked upon as signs of the vicinity of land. We, however, saw none till daybreak in the morning of the 18th, when an island was discovered bearing northeast by east, and soon after we saw more land bearing north and entirely detached from the first. Both had the appearance of being high land, unquote. It was Kauai that was first sighted, and the ship went on to reconnoiter other of the Hawaiian Islands, which Cook called the Sandwich Islands, after the fourth Earl of Sandwich, who was First Lord of the Admiralty when the discovery was made. Later, the islands were called Hawaii after the Hawaiian Mokopuni o Hawaii. Some accounts add that Captain Cook was the first Westerner to arrive at the Hawaiian Islands, since Polynesian navigators got there somewhere between 1200 to 1500 years before Cook arrived. One estimate puts the size of the human population of Hawaii upon Cook's arrival at about 250,000 persons. Given their remoteness, the islands of the South Pacific were among the last places on Earth to be settled by human beings. Before the Polynesians, the islands of the South Pacific were populated by what biogeographers sometimes call sweepstakes dispersion routes, because the methods are all unlikely, with the chance of successful dispersion by these routes being about as good as winning a lottery. And the more distant and isolated the island, the more unlikely it was to be colonized by species from the mainland. Birds can fly to most islands, but distant and isolated islands sometimes only get their bird species when they are blown there on a storm. Insects can easily arrive by floating logs, but sometimes larger animals such as mammals will manage to survive a voyage on a natural log raft and find themselves washed up on the shore of a tropical island. As a result, island biogeography is distinctive, and this played an important role in Darwin's experience of his voyage of the Beagle in the century after Captain Cook, with the indigenous bird species of the Galapagos Islands apparently sticking in Darwin's mind. The Polynesian settlers brought with them cultivars and domesticated animals, especially pigs, which often resulted in geographically local mass extinctions of indigenous flora and fauna, which were then replaced with the imported cultivars and domesticates. Since the Polynesians didn't have a written language or a calendar, and they didn't write histories, and didn't otherwise keep records of their voyages of the exploration of the Pacific, their history can only be reconstructed after the fact by the methods of scientific history. Captain Cook's third voyage was part of the beginning of this reconstruction of the history of the human presence in the South Pacific, a reconstruction that's still continuing today with advanced technology like DNA sequencing. So we can understand the voyages of discovery like Captain Cook's as part of the growth of scientific historiography. Whatever we may say about Europeans discovering lands already populated by other peoples, or the privileging of elites in history, or the characteristic forms of rationality in different human communities, the European age of discovery still stands alone in history, as was noted by John Roberts in The Triumph of the West. Quote, Arab cartography was better than that of Europe for most of the Middle Ages, and Arab sailors had known about the magnet long before it traveled further west. Yet, though some of them knew the Earth was a sphere, Islamic scientists declared the exploration of the oceans to be impossible. The Ottoman fleets swept the surface of the eastern Mediterranean, but did not venture into the Atlantic. As a result, centuries later, when the ports of China and India were full of European and North American shipping, no junk or dhow had ever been seen in Sevilla, Bristol, or Boston. Unquote. That's from John Roberts' A Triumph of the West. When I quoted this passage previously in a written post, a reader responded saying that it would be odd not to have seen Arab, if not Ottoman ships and sailors on the Guadalquivir River in Sevilla, since they occupied Spain for 800 years. And that point is well taken, but so is Robert's points. After the Reconquista, there were no more Ottoman ships in Spanish ports, and Ottomans, the Chinese, and the Indians, while engaging in regional trade, didn't engage in the kind of exploration that characterized the voyages of Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, or Ferdinand Magellan. While this calls for historical treatment, it also calls for philosophical engagement in the relevant issues at stake. In my previous episode on Caesar crossing the Rubicon, I said that historical action is the acting out of scientific experimentation. With exploration, we can take a step beyond historical action and assert that exploration and experimentation are symmetrical to each other. That is to say, each complements the other. And Captain Cook's third voyage was explicitly conceived and carried out as a voyage of exploration. As such, Cook's exploration complemented the experimental science of his day. Experimentation is a form of the exploration of the natural world, and exploration is a form of experimentation with the natural world. So that voyages of exploration are the natural complement of the scientific revolution. And in fact, we find that the age of discovery coincides with the scientific revolution, of which it was an expression. Exploration is the acting out of scientific experimentation. In experimentation, the observer remains constant, part of the controlled conditions of the observation, while the independent variable is allowed to run its course while the dependent variable in the experiment is monitored. In exploration, the observer is immersed in the world observed, and so becomes the dependent variable responding to the independent variables encountered in the exploration. So exploration is role reversal in experimentation. Exploration and experimentation are two aspects of the same human impulse to discovery. Seen in this light, Cook's voyage and his discovery of the Hawaiian Islands is part of the unfolding of scientific reason in history, though I'm well aware that not many historians today would be likely to accept that narration of events. However, if we do narrate the discovery of Hawaii in this way, we can see its place within the larger framework of philosophy of history. In previous episodes, I've said that one of the central questions of philosophy of history is the role of reason in history. We find this theme appearing time and again in different contexts, just as often taking the form of a denial or even a repudiation of it, as it does take the form of affirmation. And a definitive denial of any role for reason in history would be an important finding for philosophy of history. A denial of the role of reason in history could be called a non-cognitivist philosophy of history. In my most recent episode on Eric Voegelin, I suggested that we could call Voegelin's philosophy a non-cognitive philosophy of history. When I used non-cognitive philosophy of history in this episode, I'd never run into this use before. But just a couple of days ago, I was reading Mark Day's The Philosophy of History, and I found his use of non-cognitive in the context of philosophy of history. Day wrote, quote, "Just as the moral non-cognitivist understands moral statements as expressing some emotion or wish, so the historical holistic non-cognitivist understands historical accounts above the level of the atomic statement as expression of some value," unquote. So, as it turns out, the idea of historical non-cognitivism is not unknown, but the role of reason in history should be about more than whether or not history can be accessible to cognition. It's about how history is cognized and what kind of cognition is involved. And all cognition is not created equal. And here is what we may call the problem of Hawaii is especially relevant. Captain Cook's return to Hawaii the next year after the discovery of the island resulted in his death in a confrontation with the island's population on 14 February 1779. Clearly, relationships between the ship's crew and the Hawaiian Islanders had deteriorated since their first encounter in 1778, which was, by all accounts, peaceful, if not celebratory. This was truly a clash of civilizations then that occurred after that peaceful initial encounter. I could tendentiously call it an Enlightenment era clash of civilizations, which is telling because the Enlightenment always had a hard time coming clean about violence, conflict, and warfare. And this clash of civilizations continues to be contested. Its contestation is part of the ongoing aftermath of this clash of civilizations, which could then be said to echo down through subsequent history. The relationship of Captain Cook to Hawaii and its natives has been the occasion of a political and scholarly controversy that continues on today at several levels. Marshall Solins was a scholar of anthropology of the Pacific, and his book, Islands of History, as well as his papers and lectures, provoked a response from GananathObeyesekere and with his book, The Apotheosis of Captain Cook, European Myth-Making in the Pacific. Obeyesekere's book was in turn the occasion of Solins' response in the form of another book, How Natives Think, about Captain Cook, for example. Sometimes the debate is summarized in terms of how the rationality of indigenous peoples is to be understood. We can also think of it as the problem of historically situated reason versus transcendent ahistorical reason. While we can call all of this an historical controversy or an anthropological controversy, at bottom there are philosophical disagreements about the interpretation of history and the nature of human rationality, and therefore this is also material for philosophy of history. If human rationality, I should say, is human rationality the same in all human beings everywhere, or does it take different forms in different times and places? This debate between Obeyesekere and Solins from the 1990s needs to be placed in a larger and older context of the anthropological conception of the primitive. Anthropologists now hate the word primitive. A former friend of mine who had studied anthropology told me that anthropologists refer to primitive as the P word, since it now carries a great number of unwelcome associations. But it wasn't always thus. Edward Burnett Tyler, in his 1871 book, Primitive Culture, and Lewis Henry Morgan, in his 1877 book, Ancient Society, employed a taxonomy of human societies using savage and barbarian as terms of classification with specialized meanings. This wouldn't fly today, but as recently as 1962, the French structuralist anthropologist Lévi-Strauss wrote a book on what he called the savage mind. The dialogue, such as it was between Solins and Obeyesekere, carries all the political connotations that have become so painfully obvious in our time. I could even call this exchange one of the foundations of the culture wars. But this dialogue of the 1990s was indebted to the older dialogue on primitivism, savagery, and barbarism, which, as I said, were technical terms in their time, but which then later came to carry unwelcome connotations and so came to be studiously avoided. Obeyesekere and Solins were the heirs and continuators of an anthropological dialogue that includes Lévi-Brühl and Lévi-Strauss inter alia back through Tyler and Morgan, if not before them. The debate should also be taken to take place within the larger context of evolutionary psychology, which contextualizes human intelligence in the evolution of the terrestrial biosphere, and beyond that, the even larger context of astrobiology, which implies the possibility of cognitive astrobiology, which places mind in the context of life understood in its cosmological context. The cosmological context is justified not only on theoretical grounds, because we can always expand the scope of our inquiry in the pursuit of absolute generality, which one you could argue is a form of universal rationality. It's also justified on mythological grounds, since one of the points at issue is whether the Hawaiians believed that Captain Cook was an incarnation of their god Lono. Mythology is cosmology before the scientific revolution. So if the Hawaiians interpreted the world in mythological terms and placed Captain Cook within their pantheon, we can take this mythology as a proto-cosmology and compare and contrast it to the proto-scientific cosmology of Cook's expedition. And this latter, this scientific cosmology, is still unfinished in our time, therefore still a proto-scientific cosmology and therefore not yet a pure species of the genus. This clash between cosmologies becomes a debate over the nature of the rationality of 18th century Hawaiians and English sailors as reflected in the status of Captain Cook among the Hawaiians. Did the Hawaiians really believe that Captain Cook was the incarnation of Lono? If they did, why did they later kill Cook? And if they didn't, why did they ritually clean and preserve Cook's bones? And why did 4 Hawaiian chiefs eat Cook's heart as part of their ritual before some of the bones were returned to the expedition? We can ask, did the Hawaiians believe their myths? Which is a question that we've encountered previously in the work of Paul Vin, who had asked in the title of one of his books, did the Greeks believe in their myths? This is a problem of historically situated rationality. According to the historicist, all reason is historically situated. According to an absolutist, there is a transcendent standard of rationality that stands outside history. Obeyesekere's pragmatic rationality, as we'll shortly see, is a kind of absolutist rationality that stands outside history and is equally applicable to 18th century Hawaiians as it is to us today. Whether you take the position of the historicist or the absolutist, or some position in between these two polar extremes, we don't only encounter this in clashes of civilizations as between the English sailors and the Hawaiians, we're also forced to deal with it within our own civilization in the case of the relationship between Greek rationality and Greek mythology, as discussed by Paul Vin. Historically situated reason can be situated synchronically, as in the clash of civilizations between Captain Cook and the Hawaiians, or it can be diachronically situated, as in the clash we feel between the kind of rationality we inherited from the Greeks and the apparent irrationality of Greek mythology. So was Captain Cook Lono to the Hawaiians, or was he not? Was Zeus born in a grotto on the island of Crete? Did the Hawaiians or the Greeks believe in their myths? Were the Hawaiians only pretending to identify Cook as Lono, all the while grinning at each other on side and poking each other in the ribs with their elbows? There's no way I can summarize the full exchange between Solons and Obeyesekere, but I want to leave you with a couple of quotes to give you at least a flavor of the debate. Obeyesekere thought that Solons made fools of the Hawaiians by arguing that they were so stupid as to believe that Captain Cook was an incarnation of Lono. He makes much of what he called practical rationality, which he believed characterized the attitudes and actions of the Hawaiians. Obeyesekere wrote, quote, "The Weberian idea of a pragmatic rationality has a utilitarian quality about it. I want to divest it of its utilitarian aura and expand it to include reflective decision-making by a calculation or weighing of the issues involved in any problematic situation. Although practical decision-making is also intrinsic to common sense, it is the reflective element that distinguishes practical rationality from common sense. Geertz perceptively shows that the famous Azande witchcraft explanations might well be mystical, but they are also used to protect Azande common sense assumptions regarding their world. Furthermore, Geertz recognizes that whereas there is a taken for granted quality, naturalness, to common sense, practical rationality, as I use it, is a much more reasoned and reflective way of thinking, unquote. Solons wrote that he originally intended his response to Obeyesekere to be a pamphlet, and he had what he called a suitably 18th century title for his pamphlet. And this ultimately unused pamphlet title is a good one for what it tells us about the exchange, which was as follows: Natives versus Anthropologists, or How GananathObeyesekere Turned the Hawaiians into Bourgeois Realists on the grounds that they were natives just like Sri Lankans, in oppositions to anthropologists and other prisoners of Western metaphysical thinking. So that was Solon's unused pamphlet title that got reduced into just being How Natives Think. And Solon's pamphlet, as the title became reduced, turned into a book with 17 appendices. And in it, Solons wrote, quote, "The alleged divinity of Cook will seem a slander so long as one follows Obeyesekere in reducing the veridical to the objectivity of the instrumental. The appeal is not simply to our moral sense, but to our common sense. Obeyesekere's practical rationality is a common or garden variety of the classic Western sensory epistemology, the mind as mirror of nature. As it happens, his defense of Hawaiian rational capacities, like their ability to perceive that Cook was just a man or that Britain was not in heaven, is an affected anti-ethnocentrism that ends by subsuming their lives in classic Occidental dualisms of logos and mythos, empirical reason and mental illusion," unquote. Mark Day's book, which I quoted earlier, also briefly mentions the Solons versus Obeyesekere exchange, also quoting Paul Roth to the effect that no evidence is going to settle the dispute between the two. For Day, this means that history is underdetermined by the evidence, and the underdetermination of history leads to anti-realism in history. Day wrote, quote, "If no evidence can determine which historiography is correct, then the past itself cannot determine which historiography is correct. Anything may be said with regard to X, since there is no X to constrain such talk," unquote. Day wasn't arguing for this view, but rather he was attributing it to Paul Roth, among others who could be characterized as anti-realists in history. There is an unrepresented point of view in the debate between Obeyesekere and Solons and those who have carried it on to the present day, and that is a providential philosophy of history in which Hawaiian mythology is true, and Captain Cook actually was Lono, and that Hawaiians rightly identified him as such. If this sounds ridiculous to you, and yes, it does sound ridiculous, then consider the case of cargo cults. The naturalistic explanation for cargo cults is the misidentification of human beings and human activities, even at their most mundane, as divine. But even today, there are true believers in John Frum at Vanuatu. The cargo cult believer can appeal to the miraculous appearance of cargo, perhaps the work of ancestral spirits, and the true believer in Cook as the incarnation of Lono can point to the recognition of Cook as Lono by the Hawaiians and the adoration paid to his person both in life and in death. If an anti-realist or non-cognitivist conception of history means that history is so underdetermined that no evidence can distinguish between mutually exclusive historiographies, then it's also so underdetermined that it can't exclude the possibility that Captain Cook was Lono. What evidence could we possibly produce that would prove that Captain Cook wasn't Lono? Is this the reductio ad absurdum of anti-realism? Maybe. At very least, if your theory of history has led you to the point that you can't distinguish between mythology and rationality, then you're probably no longer doing philosophy of history. But then again, this is my own historically situated rationality, and it may differ from yours. In any case, I hope you'll join me celebrating the discovery of the Hawaiian Islands and the career of Captain Cook, whether or not he was Lono. So thanks for listening.